All right, it's now at Chapter 5, Section 1. We are covering progressivism. So, people who made up the progressive movement came from all walks of life. They came from different political parties, social classes, ethnic groups, and religions. A lot of them are going to come from the emerging middle class whose power began to grow. However, the portion of it, a lot of it is going to be of industrial workers, which is going to make sense because they are the targeted group of all of the kind of injustices going on in this time period. Progressivists believe that rapid industrialization and urbanization of the U.S. created a lot of social and political problems, and they really sought to fix this issues for the poor through state and national legislation. Currently, a lot of it is being handled by local legislation, which means it's different based on city to city. They wanted to standardize it across the board in either state or national legislation, so people can't ignore it in bigger cities and do it in smaller cities or something like that. They wanted to create a more efficient government that benefited the people. At this time, it's really focusing on benefiting the large corporations, stuff like that. And that's how the one thing they realize with that is that the US is really corrupt, and part of it is because a big business has a hold of the government. So the first one, what problems do they target? Government. Some believes that if you fix the government, the rest would follow suit. Their goal was to remove all the corrupt officials, and in specific, they're going to target political machines and dismantle their bribery system. Bribery system, which I'll explain on the next slide, but I'm not going to get into that actually. The next slide talks about the bribery system or whatever, but the corrupt officials ran deep. It was all the way up from the federal government down to the local, and it allowed for maybe political figures to get away with specific things, and they often were paid off by the businesses to do specific things, but with specific ways, get laws done a specific way. So what's a political machine? A political machine is just a group in which an authoritative leader or a small group command the support of a core of supporters and businesses who receive rewards for their efforts. Ultimate goal was to win elections. So this man in this picture's name is Boss Tweed. He particularly focused on Irish communities, and he had little cronies, and I say cronies because that's what they were. They would go out and they would basically threaten these people that lived in these parts of the town to get them to vote specific ways or do specific actions, work in specific places. And this is going to put a lot of pressure on people who can't really afford to be fired or kicked out and get them to vote specific ways so that they don't lose their job or lose their home. And he was one of the most famous ones. So what else did they target? Living conditions. With corruption and rapid industrialization comes the lack of attention to unintended consequences of the poor living condition. The idea was that previously there were no laws, and what would happen is people would call and be like, dude, I live in a crappy living situation. Like, there's no plumbing, the sanitation here is less than satisfactory, and if we're being honest, I don't have a window. And they would get these government officials to come out and look, and then these landlords would pay off these government officials, resulting in zero change. So we're seeking to get laws to stop that from being legal. So big businesses were also a problem, focusing on the takedown of trust and argued for more opportunities for small business owners. We've talked about this. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was rendered essentially useless. And that was in the last chapter, we knew that. And so this progressive movement is focusing on pushing people to actually attack these trusts and these monopolies and stop them from existing. And you have to do that in so many different ways, because the problem is these corporations are paying off officials to do this. So you kind of got to work around that. Wealth gap. There is an increasingly large wealth gap for the extremely poor and the extremely wealthy. And the social welfare laws are hoping to break that. So there's always going to be a poor and there's always going to be a rich. However, you don't want the division between the two extremes to be so big that they're not even remotely close to each other. Now, I mean, I get it, rich and poor. I'm sorry, my dog just ate cat poop. So anyways, you want that to be a healthy mix. You don't want it to be so far apart that they're like extremes on each end. So, and that's based on an average, not just like one or two people. So social welfare laws to help government, children and government regulations to aid workers and consumers to keep them from being really, really poor. We're going to skip through that. So the tension was needed. We needed to talk about this. This needed to be brought to the forefront. So, like we talked in previous chapters, journalism is a big thing at this time, and it's going to play a key role in the reform of the American system. Sensational journalism is going to bring certain public controversial topics and issues to. So, it's going to bring a lot of controversial topics and issues to the forefront. Investigative journalism is also going to be something that comes about this time, exposing many acts of corruption and mistreatment to the public eye. Go. So, President Theodore Roosevelt realizes how important this is and agrees that everything that's being written needs to be addressed. However, he creates a name for these investigative journalists, that kind of becomes not a positive name. He calls them a muckraker. So, a muckraker, think of it this way. You make some soup, right? And all of the stuff that everything that you make goes to the bottom, right? And then you take your spoon and you stir the soup. And you bring everything that's to the bottom, that is sank to the bottom, up to the top. Basically, all the dirt that sat in the bottom in this water or whatever in the US has now come to light and is being brought into visibility. Okay? And these articles would be everywhere, making it hard to escape the injustices and corruption. So Lincoln Steffens, the published The Shame of the City, focused on how government of the Philadelphia allowed the utility companies to charge high and excessive fees. He also uncovered deep corruption amongst the government officials in Philly, accepting bribes and threatening voters. Fun fact, bribing and threatening voters is a federal offense. You cannot do that. Voting is supposed to be done of your own free will. And you can't if this is going on, right? So Jacob Riis, a photographic journalist who published photos of the unsafe and crowded living conditions of those living in tenement apartments in the NYC, the New York City. So How the Other Half Lives, that's what it's called. And it is actually still visible today. You can look it up. So I have it pulled up, I believe. Yes. Give me 1 second. My computer is a little slow right now. Okay, so let's scroll up a little bit. Some of these photos you've seen from PowerPoints that I've shared or done in class. So here's an alleyway filled with grossness, right? That's Jacob Riis. So here is a poor woman in the alleyway. Here's another one. I don't know why that kid's face looks like that. Don't ask me, but they all look poor, right? They look kind of dirty. It doesn't look great, right? Here's more of the streets. Dilapidated buildings we talked about. See how close they are together. This is where that whole clothesline scenes come from, where like a bunch of clothes hanging. The dirty streets that we talked about. These are just cots that you could rent. We've seen this one. Begging or panhandling is not a new thing. Here's a blind man doing it. This woman lives in a tent. On that. In the middle of the winter. Trash. This is kind of a normal appearance. Really standard with what things looked like. And people were able to turn a blind eye to this. They didn't have to pay any attention to it because nobody saw it. Rich people didn't go to the salon. They bought their stuff in nice stores across town where none of this was a thing. Ida Tarbell. Writers spoke out about the tactics that Rockefeller used to drive competition out. This was both dangerous to do, but she also was a tad bit more risky considering she was a female. To point out some of the stuff that Rockefeller used could have been really costly for her, not just like in money wise, but maybe she could have been like threatened, things like that. Men of certain power can make things happen and not get in trouble. Novelists also take part in this. Novelists wanted to shed a light on the issue as well, so they developed a new genre of writing. It's called the naturalist novel. And this genre portrayed true misery and struggles of common people through fiction. So how did they expose this? Theodore Dreiser, a Midwestern impoverished man, published a book called Sister Carrie. It told the story of a small town girl being thrown into the brutal lifestyle of city living. The story follows this girl who's basically been sold that she can live her dream in the city if she moves, only later to find out when she gets there, basically, she is poor. She's tired. She's sick. She's filthy. She lives in a tenement apartment with a bunch of other people, and she hates her life. Upton Sinclair wrote one of the most famous and provocative novels of all time. He published The Jungle, which outlined the despair and harsh conditions of immigration workers in the Chicago stockyards. It revealed a lot of the unsanitary conditions of the industry. One of the things that it focuses on most that I'm going to have to talk about myself is that the Chicago stockyards is where actually meat was chopped and packaged, and often sometimes canned. Well, in these particular conditions, they were told to work fast, hard, and it was dim. So a lot of times there would be injuries. Now, something that's actually really gross is that sometimes they would cut off a finger and no one would notice at first, and they would go and get treatment, but they wouldn't notice that a finger maybe had fallen into a can of food. Or maybe while they were grinding up meat, they got their finger, and the tip of their finger has now been grinded into, ground beef, ground turkey, ground chicken, sausages, things like that. So really unsanitary. Then on top of that, he also outlines that cows were not being stored properly, so they were going bad, and then they were taking that bad meat and selling it. Sometimes if the meat was too bad, they would ground it up with all the good meat and sell it like ground beef. We don't really have time to watch this, but we're going to move on. So progressivism finally takes hold. With the muckrakers drawing attention to the woes of society, progressivism blossoms into a movement due to public support, preaching reforms to improve living conditions and public health in schools. Finally, they have a ground to stand on, and it means that they can finally talk about some of the things that they've been trying to get done for years. On top of this, there's a movement called the social gospel going on, and it's utilizing the Bible to preach kindness, charity, and justice to find the kingdom of God on earth. So essentially focusing on bettering earth to be in the kingdom of God later. So they start working on fixing, some issues amongst the poor while also providing them with charity and also making sure that they're being treated justly. Walter Rauschenbusch was a German socialism and American progressivism and American progressivist. Used German socialism and American progressivism, popular amongst Protestants. Okay, social gospel gained support, which led to leaders asking for child labor laws, shorter work weeks, and limited powers of corporations, because all of these violate basic types of kindness and justice. Kids shouldn't work long hours. One of the main goals was to improve the life of impoverished people. So settlement houses did attempt this by being a community center that provided social services to the urban poor. Social services can vary from a lot of things. It provided mothers with child care classes, immigrants with English lessons, and actually ran nursery schools and kindergartens, which helped these women go out, get jobs, and learn things for themselves so they could also help support their families. It even provided dance, theater, and art programs for adults. Poor people deserve fun too, right? So this is where you'll see dance halls emerge, and some types of more like provocative dancing back then actually comes from places like this. One of the most famous settlement houses was Hull House in Chicago, which was founded by Jane Addams. It became one of the largest settlement houses at 13 buildings. It would inspire the expansion of settlement houses all over the United States, and actually really sparks the creation of the social worker career and really takes off, finally giving them actually something to do, and people realize that they're actually really essential to keeping a lot of the lower income families keeping connected to resources and supplies and jobs. Especially these women would be middle class women who would start taking this job. So this is the first whole house. By the end, it becomes this big. Crazy, right? The YMCA was also founded around this time, which provided services only to the urban poor, but only men. It's the young, I know it's men Christian something, just for men. There's also the YWCA, but you get my point. Movement reaches children in reforming many aspects of their lives. Some are still in place today. Florence Kelly, she was a lawyer, which was really hard for women to be back then. Led the effort on child welfare, and she convinces Illinois to ban child labor. And it causes a lot of other states to do that as well. However, there's a lot of pushback with this. This was big to ban child labor, especially during this time period, and businesses utilized child labor because they could underpay them, and they usually lasted a lot longer at jobs because they had a lot more energy, depending on their age range, right? Kelly formed the National Child Labor Committee in 1902, which lobbied to create the U.S. Children's Bureau in 1912. This agency examined any issues that affected the health and welfare of children. A major backslide, though, on this children's welfare occurred after passing the Keating-Owens Act, which banned child labor. The Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional because it was considered a form of controlling business, and that was still considered kind of taboo at this time, and regulations on business was a violation of the Constitution. So they determined that this was not allowed because you cannot tell businesses who they can and cannot hire, and who they have to hire. It would basically remain this way until 1938, just because corporations are going to remain really in control of things. And also during, you know, the Great Depression, there's not going to be a lot of jobs going around, and giving children jobs instead of adults who actually need it becomes kind of an issue, so they decide to ban it. On top of trying to end labor, some began tackling the idea of education. Some wanted to make school compulsory for longer, which began the debate of what do we teach then? Some wanted skill-based learning, and some wanted creative learning. John Dewey wanted to mix a mix of history, geography, arts, and skills. This becomes the favored method today. If you teach an entire group of kids only about art or only about skill-based, they don't have the well-roundedness. So although you think that your history classes are pointless, or that your English classes are pointless, or you don't understand why you learn math, it's to give you the opportunity to be well-rounded in all aspects, and gives you access to learn a little bit of everything, so you can kind of figure out what you like. Part of society that needed the most help was the industrial aspect. Looking at working conditions, reformers really dove in. So in 1911, something called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory happened, and it was the epitome of unsafe working conditions. With poor ventilation, locked doors for exits, and unsafe machinery, it becomes a breeding ground for a terrible fire. So what happened was a shirtwaist is so if you look at like the old-timey outfits that women used to wear, they wore those high skirts, and then they wore those blouses at the top. Well, that's a shirtwaist because it only was a shirt to your waist. Well, shirtwaists are made out of cotton, and I don't know if you noticed, but cotton fibers are particularly flammable. So as they were making these shirts, the shirtwaists, cotton fibers were flying out here and there everywhere. And since there was no ventilation, these cotton fibers were not moving. And so what happened was someone like lit a cigarette. Nobody really knows exactly what happened. When a fire broke out. And the other part that made this so dangerous was the foremans had locked the exits from the outside because people kept leaving to take breaks, and they didn't like that. So when the fire broke out, they couldn't even leave. And those that could leave, oh, no, no, no. What are you doing? Stop it. That's not what I want you to do. Those that could leave tried to go down the elevator, got stuck, and died. Those that there weren't really like an access to stairs because those doors were also locked. If you did get out, the emergency fire exits were only halfway built, so they couldn't use them to get out of the building. And so with all of this, it was no surprise when fire broke out that it was devastating. Fire killed roughly 146 workers, mostly young women, because that's primarily who's going to work in the textile factories, is young women. because at this time women are really handy with sewing and for like making clothes. So the fire was so intense that women were literally jumping out of the window because they'd rather die instantly than burn to death. They didn't know what else to do, and then you had the fire department on the ground trying to catch them with those like trampoline things they try to catch people with. But the drop of the people was so intense that sometimes they would catch them, but they would still hit the ground and die. And people will talk like they would talk about this, and people would be like, "Well, I heard these thuds, and I didn't realize what it was." And then I realized it was people jumping out of the windows. After all of this, progressives demand reform, and New York made reforms with others following them. Some even get states to limit workdays to 10 hours, but later that was ruled unconstitutional again by the Supreme Court in 1905. Basically determines that this is another attempt to regulate, industry, and that is not a thing that we do with the Constitution. It's a violation of constitutional rights. So progressives realize that in order to reform the society, they must reform the government first, focusing on making a government for the people and not for corporations. So corruption and inefficiency plagued the governments down to the city level. And a natural disaster in Galveston actually really kind of exposes this to people. So Galveston fired their entire local government and replaced it with a 5-person commission because of the slowness to rebuild, after suffering an 8,000 deaths from a hurricane. Galveston is a city in Texas on the coastline. Basically, the previous entire local government failed to prepare, protect, and ensure the safety of their people. And then afterwards, when it was time to rebuild, they spent more time focusing on rebuilding businesses for corporations rather than for the people. So they fired them and put in a 5-person commission because the people wanted some normalcy back. The commission system was most efficient and less prone to corruption because you could have 5 people on the board. You'd have to convince all 5 people to do the same immoral act. And usually it was just 1 or 2, and then you could vote them out. This is Galveston. And one of the parts that was really annoying was that these poor people in this picture are actually mostly African Americans. Some of the wealthier white people were fine, and their houses were rebuilt kind of fast, but minorities were kind of excluded from this. So the next reform focused on elections. Traditionally, parties picked candidates for state and local governments. Wisconsin came up with a direct primary, which was an election where citizens themselves have to vote to select nominees for upcoming elections. By 1916, all states but 4 had moved to this. Primary just means, okay, we have 10 different candidates that we might want to run for mayor. We have to bring them down to 2. So everybody votes on the 10, and the top 2 become the main candidates for mayor. It's kind of simple. We also see the introduction of 3 new ways that citizens can get issues on the ballot, forcing officials to listen to the wishes of their constituents for the first time. First, you see an initiative. It gave the people the power to put a proposed new law directly on the ballot by collecting signatures. A referendum allowed for citizens to approve or reject laws passed by legislators. We actually had a referendum a couple years back. It was a law about like the right to work states or something like that. A bunch of people went around and collected signatures, which got it to be put back on the floor, and it was actually repealed. Recall means give citizens the power to remove public officials from office before their term ended. I don't know of any officials locally or recently that had that happen, but it's actually a really powerful tool to keep people from kind of screwing over their constituents. A lot of this was able to be passed because of waves of progressive governors being elected. Robert La Follette was Wisconsin, and his was the direct primary. Hiram Johnson was in California and fought big businesses. Theodore Roosevelt, as in the Theodore Roosevelt, president, New York and the fair system in Texas. And Woodrow Wilson, also President Woodrow Wilson, was New Jersey and reduced the power for the railroads. That's where we'll stop. This is where we'll pick back up next time.